Hello, and welcome to the 741 channel. Thank you for stopping by. This video is going to show how I disassembled, inspected, cleaned, lubricated, and reassembled the wiper motor assembly for my 2004 Chevy Tahoe. If you missed the previous video where I showed some troubleshooting and removal of the wiper assembly, you can find a link to that in the description below, or you can click the card above. So I've got the wiper motor assembly here on the bench, and let's see if we can take it apart, or at least take a look at this shaft here and see if there's something in there jamming it up. I'm seeing signs of corrosion on here, so I'm wondering if it's just corroded up inside and that's why it's not working. The first thing I'll do is remove this bracket that is behind the assembly. Now that the bracket's out of the way, I'm going to remove this plastic cover that's here. I'm just going to pry up on this tab and pull that out. And there's another tab on the bottom. And, oh, there's one on the side there too. Okay. So you can see there's a circuit board assembly in here. And this looks like it's in good shape. It's got some conformal coating on it. So I expect that everything in here is probably okay, but I'm not going to rule anything out at this point. So it looks like this circuit board is just held on with some plastic tabs. And if we just bend the tabs out of the way, the board should come out of here. The reason I want to remove this circuit board is that there is another Torx head screw that's holding this plastic assembly on buried under the circuit board. And I want to remove this out of the way so that we can see inside of here and see if we can clean up. It looks like there's just a bunch of corrosion in here, and that may be the problem. This may just be seized up from corrosion. So if we can get this loosened up, maybe we can get this thing working. Okay, so I see what's going on here. These metal contacts up here are actually connecting into fingers that are in the plastic below it. So there's a bunch up here, and then there's a couple over here on this side. And we'll just kind of gently pry everything up. So I've got a T20 Torx bit here, and I'm going to pull these off. This isn't exactly the right tool to use, but saves me a trip from going upstairs. Okay, so now this is loose, but the problem is that these two contacts are soldered to the motor. We're going to have to unsolder these contacts here to get the plastic out of the way. So that shouldn't be too big of a deal. We'll just fire up the soldering iron here. So on the back of this, you can see there's 3 fingers there and some grease. I presume that's some sort of conductive grease. So we'll set that over there. And then back here you can see there's some more of that grease, and there's a metal contact that looks like a brass or something. Now of course those fingers make contact with this brass plate as the motor spins back and forth. Down here is a worm gear with another blob of grease to keep it self-lubricated, presumably, as everything is moving. Presumably that is not conductive grease. That's probably regular grease, so to speak. But so this is not loose or anything like that. It doesn't want to slide out of the shaft. But it looks like down here there's an Allen screw that I can remove to kind of loosen this worm gear. Basically what I want to try and do here is relieve any tension that's on this and then test the motor. And that'll tell us whether or not the motor is good, and we just need to replace something in here. So removing this Allen screw didn't really help. I couldn't really get the worm gear out because this is stuck. I can't rotate it. So because this is engaged and meshed, it won't move. So that didn't help. I think the only thing that I can do at this point, I mean, it doesn't look like there's any locking clips or anything in here that can be released to let this gear come off of here. So what I think I'm going to try and do is just pound on this with a hammer. Not too hard, but just tap on it and see if I can get it to free up and fall out. So let me take that upstairs, we'll try that and see what happens. So the hammer trick worked. I was able to tap that out. As you can see, it's now out. And it's moving freely, but it's stiff in there. So let me just see if I can work it the rest of the way out. Okay, so there's the shaft. I mean, I don't see any rust on there or anything, but it just did feel like it was turning tighter than it should be. There's a little bit of wetness on the shaft there. I don't know if that's grease or water, or it might even be windshield washer fluid. Anyway, I'm going to set this part aside now. If you look down that bore, it looks clean. There's no evidence of, any marring or anything down there, so it should be okay. At the end, you can see the corrosion on the outer part, but the inside looks okay. A little bit of corrosion, but not bad. So what I'm going to do now is test the motor by putting 12 volts across the contacts to see if it spins freely and doesn't have any issues. I have a 12 volt power supply back here that I can use for just that purpose. So now I'll take my power supply leads and just touch them to the contacts on the motor, and let's see if everything spins freely. Okay, that looks and sounds and feels good to me. I don't see any issue. Let's reverse the leads and see if everything goes backwards. Okay, that seems okay to me as well. So I think the motor is good, and we're just dealing with a little bit of minor corrosion in there that was getting everything kind of hung up. So I cleaned up the shaft. I mean, it really wasn't dirty per se. I didn't really have any corrosion stuck to it, but I gave it a light scrub with a 3M scrubby pad here just to get off any loose stuff. It's nice and smooth and clean. At least that's the way it feels. And then for the bore here in the housing, I cut a piece of the scrubby pad here, you can see, and I ran it down through and kind of scrubbed it back and forth, and I ended up popping out this O-ring. So I took a look in it with a magnifying loupe, and you can see that, well, maybe about a ½ inch down in. I'm sure it's not going to show up in the camera, so you'll have to take my word for it, but ½ inch down in the bore here, or in this sleeve that's in the bore rather, there's a groove, and that is where this O-ring fits into. So this is supposed to keep out the moisture and keep everything from getting seized up and all that sort of thing, I guess, water from getting into the motor. But from what I could tell, most of the corrosion was within that ½ inch that's above the O-ring, where the dirt and road salt and wiper fluid and everything will get in there. So I think the O-ring was doing its job. It just, was seized up at the end. So I guess I can start reassembly. So let's see if I can get this O-ring back in here. So I got the O-ring in, and it took a couple of tries, but I was able to use this bent end sort of poker tool to help push it in and kind of guide it where I needed to go. But what ended up happening is it kept trying to push past the groove. I found that this nut driver was just the right diameter to kind of slip in there and block the bottom of the shaft. So I pushed this in just far enough to kind of keep the O-ring from being able to go any further. This sort of braced it, and I was able to push it in and get it to pop into the groove there. What I'm going to do now is scavenge a little bit of this grease from inside the worm gear area, and I'm going to put it in the shaft where the O-ring is. There's plenty of room in that groove to hold a little bit of grease, and I think that will help sort of keep things from binding up in the future. So I went and got some chassis grease out of my grease gun, and I put a layer on the shaft here. So now I'm going to start reassembling this, but one thing I want to mention, I want to note that there's a groove here in the back of this gear that goes almost halfway around the entire gear. This slot engages with this tab that's on the body of the wiper motor. Basically what this does is this gear will be able to spin between this range of motion, and sort of these ends on the gear will stop when it hits the end of the tab. And that, in conjunction with these tabs and the fingers that are on the back of that other piece of plastic, help the motor figure out when to turn back and forth, so to speak. So I'm not positive, but I don't believe the clocking of the gear matters. There's no indicator as to where this needs to be positioned, in other words. But as long as this tab fits into this groove, I think we're okay. I think the electronics will sort out where it needs to be in the end. Alright, so that's all there is to it. You can see that pushed in. Got a little bit of grease on the end of the shaft there, but that'll be okay. So now I'll bring this back and place it over the housing. I'll line up the solder tabs, but before I solder them in place, I'm going to put one of these screws in just to kind of hold everything together and make it a little easier to. So now that I have the plastic piece in place, I've just got the screws in to hold it. They're not tight, so this can kind of still move around a little bit. So now what I'll do is solder these tabs in, and what I'm going to do first is let the old solder reflow, and then I'll add a little bit of new solder just to make sure we have a good joint. So that's all soldered up now, and should be good to go. Before I forget, I'm going to install this last screw and tighten up the other two. Now it's time to reinstall the circuit board. And we're going to reinstall these pins in the plastic through the back of the board into the contacts that are on this side of the board. This can only go one way. There's two contacts down here on the lower left that mate to two pins down here near the motor. So this is all asymmetrical. You can't put it in backwards. Press it in from the edges, make sure everything seats in. Now there's also these tabs here in the plastic that'll help guide and lock the board in. So now I'll reinstall this cover. This goes with the wording towards the top, and you can see there's little ears on here that align up to these plastic clips. So I'll get that oriented that way. I'll also note that in the back of the plastic there's sort of a channel that the cover fits into to help seal everything up. Next up, I'm going to reinstall the mounting bracket. The orientation of the bracket is such that the ears that mount to the truck hang down below the motor, and the point of the triangle, so to speak, points up toward the connector. And also important to note is that there's some stamped numbers on the bracket that should be facing out. In other words, don't install the bracket this way. Install it this way with the numbers readable and with the mounting ears bent out. Next up, I'm going to drop the plastic sleeve back over the motor shaft, and you can see there's a groove on the piece that slips into a tab that's down here on the motor body. Just drop that on like that, and then this piece goes on, and I believe this goes sort of in the opposite orientation. You can kind of see that on the plastic there's a groove there in the plastic that this tab in the rubber lines up to. So the last thing that I'll do here on the bench is put this nut for the wiper arm back on here. And originally that was on there just so I didn't lose it. It doesn't really need to be on there at this stage. I'm just putting it on there so I remember to bring it up with me when I go back out to the truck. That's pretty much it for reassembly of the wiper motor assembly. If you'd like to watch the next video where I show how I install it on my Tahoe, you can click the link in the description below, or you can click the thumbnail that'll be coming up at the end of the video. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to leave a comment or subscribe, feel free to do that as well. Thanks for watching.